This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Romulo Lollato, K-State wheat production specialist, starts the show with another hard winter wheat tour update. He explains how the crop looked from Colby to Wichita and the concerns identified on his route. Continuing the show is K-State wheat specialist Sarah Lancaster, talking about volunteer corn and the impact it can have on this year's corn and soybean crop. K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd ends today's show by discussing how to control bagworms and sawflies. He also covers the need to eliminate potential breeding environments for mosquitoes. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show with another hard winter wheat tour update with K-State wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato. Romulo, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. Good morning. It's great to be here.
Romulo, you guys have completed another day of this hard winter wheat tour, and where were you at yesterday?
Yeah, so usually during that second day, the routes, they will leave Colby early in the morning, anytime between 6 a.m. to 7 a.m., typically, because these are fairly long routes, right? So we would move from Colby either west, a little bit south, and then back east, and sleep in Wichita, right? Some routes are going to go through the central part of the state. They're a little bit shorter, but other routes go as far south as Oklahoma, and those, they need to leave fairly early. In my case, yesterday, we left Colby and we went straight south, all the way until about Lakin or so. And from there, we kind of turned east, back all the way until roughly Pratt, and went south, and then back east until Wichita. So that's the route that I took. So it's kind of like going through that western part of the state, south until Lakin. Not that very far west, but just south of Colby there. So there's probably still a couple of counties to the west of where we drove.
And on your path to Wichita yesterday, what were you seeing?
One thing that struck to me throughout the day yesterday, and it's interesting because during these tours, we typically see patterns that are more regionalized, right? Well, Southwest Kansas is looking like this, Northwest Kansas like that. But truly, one thing that stuck to me yesterday, the entire day, was how much within field variability we have this year. I think that the type of drought that we had, and what I mean by that is people had a good emergence in the fall, but then was simply a very, very dry winter and spring. And as a reminder, during that spring is when the crop is increasing a lot in biomass, right, with that stem elongation, and that's when the crop water needs also increase. Just like we have more biomass out there, the crop's going to need more water. And in that critical period, we were lacking any moisture. And I think that caused what we're seeing, this within field variability. Very spotty fields, and by spotty I mean wavy, right? So they're not nice, uniform tabletop fields as we have seen many years in Kansas. They're just like simply wavy, and those low spots are so drought stressed. We were walking in those spots, and they're like boot height or so. And then you walk a little bit more, and you might be into already like a knee or taller crop, right, like a mid-thigh or so. So a lot of variability within the same field. You might be sampling a crop that is like 15 inches tall, and a little bit down the road, 25 inches tall. So a lot of variability within the field, and that was primarily caused by drought stress. There was some freeze damage kind of across the entire route that we did yesterday as well. So we were coming across a number of heads that were just partially damaged by the freeze or even entirely damaged by the freeze. But I had the feeling that it was not as widespread as what we were seeing in the northern part of the state as well, between that Clay County and Phillipsburg. There was very consistent freeze damage there across the entire northern edge of the state, whereas here in the west and south routes that we took yesterday, it was there, but it was just not as widespread. It seemed like drought was the primary issue. Another difference that we saw from the first day as well was as I mentioned here yesterday, wheat streak mosaic was very, very consistent in that northern border. Well, interestingly, we did not see as much yesterday, and we traveled through wheat streak mosaic country, right? That southwest part of the state is typically where wheat streak mosaic is more prevalent in the state, and we did not see it as widespread as what we saw in north central Kansas this year. So there's an interesting shift in where this disease is happening. I'm not sure the causes for that. It can be related to cropping systems, right? It can be related to folks not controlling their volunteer wheat, either in that fallow preceding wheat or even inside the summer crop. And we see a lot more summer crops in central Kansas today. And so I think that there's a chance they might have some volunteer wheat as weeds in that summer crop, and we're not controlling, and they may be harboring that wheat curl mite that transmits it. But the long story short here is that I was expecting perhaps a little bit more wheat streak mosaic. Did not come across that as much. In terms of other diseases of importance, right, typically in such a dry environment like this, we don't see as much stripe or leaf rust. And that aligned with what we saw yesterday. So we did find some stripe and leaf rust, but both of those were found actually as we were moving towards the eastern part of the state, or towards the central part of the state. So Pratt County, Stafford County, Reno, Kingman, we found some stripe rust in that region, but not west from there. And another disease that was coming up yesterday, fairly consistent, was Fusarium root rot. Essentially, Fusarium root rot, or it's also known as dryland root rot. It will happen in patches, so it's pretty much patches of white plants in that field. So really plants that they were completely taken aback and perished, right? And if you get those white plants, now there's a number of things that can cause white heads in wheat during this time of the year. That's one of them. If you get those plants and you peel back the leaves towards the bottom of those stems, right, just like where they kind of are almost in the ground, it has a very typical pink discoloration, just like the Fusarium fungus that impacts corn and that impacts wheat in terms of head scab, that same discoloration. So we were seeing quite a bit of that, more typical in dry years. So I guess to some extent expected, but I guess more consistent than what I've seen in the past.
And with that variability in the different diseases, what expected yield did you guys come up with?
So in my car, we end up at 35 bushels per acre on measurements. Our eyeball estimate, because we always, before calculating the yields, we do a little game and just say, okay, what's our eyeball estimate here? It was a little bit lower than that. We were thinking 30 is probably what our route could do. But I can see how it can do 35 if conditions are right. Now, for the entire tour yesterday, that we're looking at many more routes now, all the way from the ones that went to Oklahoma, all the way until those in central Kansas. It turned out that 42 was the final estimate for the day yesterday. Can the crop make 42? Probably can if we have cool and moist conditions. However, if here 10 days down the road, it becomes hot and dry, I don't know that it can get there. In terms of growth stage of the crop, whenever we left Colby, the crop was just at that heading stage. And as we headed towards which that crop progressed in maturity, and some fields that we did later in the day, they were reaching the soft dough stage. And so talking to some growers about the expected harvest date, they believe at this point in time, their crop is about 7 to 10 days ahead of schedule. And some growers in Sumner County that I touch base with, they mentioned probably 1st of June, there will be somebody harvesting in Sumner County already, which is quite a bit early. So the crop is ahead of schedule. That can be good in terms of perhaps avoiding some heat stress later on, right? So I guess fingers crossed that the weather conditions, they are cool and moist for grain filling so that we can actually have a decent crop. If it turns dry here pretty soon and hot, or drier, I should say, and grain field turns out to be dry and hot, those fields that have already a very stress potential, they could go downhill pretty quick.
Romulo, how are you planning on finishing out this tour today?
So today, typically we leave here from Wichita and we go all the way until Manhattan. It is a shorter leg because we end up having lunch in Manhattan. We typically don't put as many stops here, but in that region east of I-35 usually is when we'll do maybe 3-4 fields in between here in Manhattan. Now, this year is a little bit different on the tour because apparently it is the 150th year anniversary of Mennonite immigration to the U.S., or maybe whenever they brought turkey red to the U.S., one of those. Don't quote me on that. And so we're going to stop by the museum, the Mennonite Museum of Agriculture in Gossel, and we're going to meet there, and we're going to go over all of that very rich history of Mennonite agriculture here in Kansas before heading back to Manhattan. So that's something new that I'm looking forward to, and I have not been to that museum yet, but it seems like the 150th anniversary is a really good motive to do that.
If you'd like to stay up to date with the rest of your tour and the rest of this wheat's growing season and harvest, how can they do that?
They can reach out to me through social media, right? So at KSU Wheat, either on X or on Facebook, and of course through email as well at lollato@ksu.edu. So either of those they can reach out to. But if they just want to have a sneak peek of what's going on and what all we're up to, absolutely social media is the way to go. So at KSU Wheat, either on Facebook or on Twitter or X.
Romulo, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby. I do appreciate your giving me some time here on the program.
Absolutely. That was K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato as he gave us an update on Day 2 of the Hard Winter Wheat Tour. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Thursday show talking about volunteer corn. And to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Wheat Specialist Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
As always, thanks for having me, Shelby.
Sarah, can you tell us some concerns that come with volunteer corn?
So when I think of volunteer corn, I think about a couple of things. Number one, I think about volunteer corn is a weed, right? A weed is anything you plant out of place, and even though that corn was a crop last year, it's still a weed this year, in my opinion. The other thing that I think about with volunteer corn goes back to that fact that it was a crop last year, right? Anytime we're dealing with volunteer crops as a weed, really I think about the fact that that weed should have been in the combine and in the bin and then sold last fall, right? Instead of being now something that I have to spend more money on to control this year. And I understand, generally speaking, all of the challenges of getting combines set correctly to prevent volunteer crops in the next spring, but it is still a factor.
And the volunteer corn can create issues potentially for this year's crops.
Yeah, so, I mentioned just general interference, right? Yield reduction, things of that nature. We can think about interference at harvest because it's probably not, especially in soybeans, right? It's going to be just in the way. Even if you have volunteer corn and corn, it's going to be something that could potentially interfere with harvest. With other volunteer crops, often you'll have me on, Shelby, to talk about volunteer wheat, right? We don't have the same level of disease concerns with volunteer corn, but that is still a possibility as well.
And so wanting to think about how this could be controlled in corn, even though it is corn in corn, how might that be handled?
So that is really challenging because, you're limited, right? So some things to think about would be letting the corn come up and then trying to kill it before you plant your corn, which is a challenge. There are a few herbicide options that would be effective, right? But one of the things that we can really think about is taking advantage of new herbicide-resistant traits. We don't have a ton of enlist corn hybrids that are being marketed heavily in Kansas right now, but indications are we're going to start to see more. So we're familiar with enlist soybeans. We're familiar with enlist cotton. Enlist corn is corn that is resistant to Roundup, Liberty, Assure, and also 2,4-D. So the key piece there is Assure, right? So Assure is a herbicide that controls grasses very well. It's one of our volunteer corn products in soybeans, right? So if we can if we have a field with a serious volunteer corn problem, we can switch to an Enlist hybrid for this year, and then we can use Assure to control last year's corn that was not resistant to Assure. So trying to take advantage of those herbicide resistance traits is one option there.
Sarah, is there a threshold for when it comes to volunteer corn being in corn versus just leaving that corn there or taking it out of the field?
Yeah, Shelby, that's a good question. So we don't really have a lot of good data to say, if you have X number of corn plants per foot of row, you need to start thinking about control. And I think that's in part because there is one theory that says volunteer corn is just more corn to put in the grain tank in the fall, right? Because it is still, going to go in the same marketing channels. So it sort of depends on, management preferences and what folks are looking for and, quite frankly, what that crop is going to be used for.
A crop that maybe has a little bit more concern when there is volunteer corn in it, soybeans.
Yeah, so volunteer corn and soybeans can be a serious problem. I know it wasn't long after I started here at K-State that I had someone come visit from out of state and they said, Sarah, I think your number 2 weed in the state of Kansas is volunteer corn. So there are times when it can be a real problem. A lot of that has to do with weather conditions at harvest and if we have a bad year for a corn crop and a lot of, light corn kernels and things of that nature. But there is a little bit of research that talks about, how much does volunteer corn hurt soybean yield. So some figures are up to about 8 or 9% when you have one plant of volunteer corn per every 10 square feet in your field. Others, if you go up to one plant per every square foot, so one for every 10 square feet was the last number, one plant per every 1 square foot is going to be up to potentially 70% yield loss for your soybeans. So it is truly a weed in that situation, Shelby.
How might people want to try to control and manage that then?
So management of volunteer corn is just like any other weed, Shelby, and it starts at planting, right? So if you think you're going to have a volunteer corn problem, some products that you should consider in your pre-emergence program would be the Authority line of products. Right, sulfentrazone is not labeled as a pre-emergence product in corn, and so those Authority products all contain sulfentrazone, and then we'll do a pretty good job of helping you with volunteer corn control at planting. So the easy button for volunteer corn control is a Group 1 herbicide. So the one that we most often recommend would be a product like Select Max. So the active ingredient there is clethodim. There are a lot of generic clethodim's on the market, Shelby. One of the challenges that we can have when we think about using a select type of product, or even I mentioned Assure earlier, so those quizalofop would be the active ingredient there. Those types of products, we know that they're prone to being antagonized with just about anything else that goes in the tank with them, but in particular with Group 4 herbicides like Enlist or Extend. So farmers that are trying to control volunteer corn in Enlist or Extend soybeans need to be really cognizant of that potential for antagonism for that reduced volunteer corn control because of the tank mix. So steps to take to overcome that would be to use the maximum rate of the product that you're using, and then also use the maximum rate of the adjuvant that you're using. Typically, that's going to be a crop oil. So maximum rates, maximum adjuvants, and then trying to control that volunteer corn early, just like any other weed, right? The smaller it is, the easier it's going to be to control.
Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about volunteer corn.
Thanks, Shelby. Always a pleasure.
That was K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. You can learn more about volunteer corn by reading her recent Agronomy e-update article titled Plan Now for Volunteer Corn Control. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find it by going to eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Secretary Tom Vilsack as he discusses the announcement of various financial measures to assist dairy growers with cattle infected with a strain of high-path avian flu.
Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack recently revealed the latest measures connected to USDA response to the H5N1 outbreak in dairy cattle in several states. While initial and continuing response revolves around requirements for testing of lactating dairy cows for interstate transport and testing, the latest series of measures are designed to support producers of dairy cattle infected with the H5N1 strain of highly pathogenic avian influenza. For instance,
to protect against the potential for spread between humans and animals, we're going to be providing financial support up to $2,000 per affected premises per month for producers who supply PPE to employees and or who provide outwear uniform laundering for producers of affected herds who facilitate the participation of workers on the farm in a USDA CDC workplace and farm workers study.
In addition, support is available for biosecurity planning and implementation.
To enable them to develop biosecurity plans based on existing secure milk supply plans that they have on the farm and recognizing the individual nature of their farming operation.
USDA will also provide $100 for producers to purchase and use an inline sampler for their milk system.
In addition, we're going to provide funding for heat treatment to dispose of milk in a biosecure fashion. Now, this is going to provide producers a safe option for the disposal of milk. Heat treatment, performed in accordance with standards set by FDA, is currently the only available method considered to effectively inactivate the virus in milk. So if a producer establishes a system to heat treat waste milk before disposal, USDA will pay that producer up to $2,000 per affected premises per month.
Secretary Vilsack adds there will also be reimbursement of veterinary costs incurred by producers associated with confirmed H5N1 cases in premises.
This is going to provide support to producers to cover the veterinary costs necessarily incurred for treating cattle infected with the virus, as well as fees that veterinarians will collect for collecting samples for testing. This will also include veterinary fees and specific supplies needed for treatment and sample collection. Veterinary costs are eligible to be covered from the initial date of positive confirmation by our labs for that farm up to $10,000 per affected premises.
Compensation will also be available through the Farm Service Agency's Emergency Assistance for Livestock, Honeybees, and Farm-Raised Fish Program, ELAP, associated with H5N1 positive tested dairy herds with reduced milk production. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Once again, that was U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rod Bain and Secretary Tom Vilsack. If you'd like to keep up to date with HPAI in Kansas, one way to do that is to check out the Kansas Department of Agriculture's website. You can find it by going to agriculture.ks.gov. Again, that is agriculture.ks.gov. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because when we come back, we'll be joined by Raymond Cloyd for this week's horticultural segment. We're cutting to that short break now.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. For this week's horticulture segment, K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd has an update on the steps that can be taken to control bagworms, sawflies, and mosquitoes. Raymond, bagworms are something that we need to be scouting for right now.
Yes, Jeff, it's getting that time of year. You need to be out looking at your conifers and broadleaf trees for those quarter-inch, eighth-inch little bags. You may not see the caterpillars, but when you see the bags, it's probably time to either hand pick them, remove them, or spray. This time of year, from about May to early June, when the bags are about eighth to quarter, you can use two products. One of them is called Bacillus thuringiensis karstaki. We call it BTK. The other one is spinosad. These are the active ingredients and materials that are out there. These are stomach poisons, which means the caterpillar inside the bag has to ingest it. And the materials work much better on smaller caterpillars than larger ones. So if you're out there and you start seeing bagworms on your thuya, you can go to one of the garden centers, nurseries, and look for a product that has BTK or spinosad as the active ingredient. Spray it. Now, you're going to probably have to make more than one application because of the fact that the eggs, the caterpillars don't all emerge from the eggs, which is how they overwinter in the dead female bag simultaneously. So maybe take 2 or 3 applications. Plus, they balloon, that is, they crawl to the top of a tree, they form a silken strand, and they just move around that way. That's why people in the west part of the state get concerned about these windbreaks all of a sudden have bagworms. So really the timing is critical. So if you can get out spray when they're young, small, then you're going to have less issues with them later on in the growing season. Because when they get to a half inch and an inch, then you're using materials that are harmful to beneficial insects and pollinators.
We're also seeing a variety of sawflies as well.
Yeah, sawflies. Let me explain what sawflies are. The larvae look like caterpillars, but they're not. And the way you tell them apart is that a sawfly larva, when you look at the abdomen, which is the back end of an insect, there are these little prolegs on every abdominal segment. Caterpillars are missing those. And why is that important? Because the product I previously mentioned, BTK, does not work on sawflies. It'll only work on caterpillars. So the three we have out right now is the brown-headed ash sawfly, which feeds primarily on ash. It's a light green insect larva with stripes running down the back. Primarily feeds on ash. The second one is the rose sawfly. And the rose sawfly right now is feeding on roses, causing the skeletonization. We call that where they feed in between the veins. And there are several species we have out there. And the third one is the European pine sawfly, which has been denuding mugos and Scots pines. And so the best way to deal with them is simply take a high-pressure water spray and dislodge them. Birds will eat them. Predators on the ground will eat them. You can use a spray. I think spinosad is registered label for sawflies and some others. But first thing I would just take a high-pressure water spray and just basically dislodge them off the plant. So those are the three species we're dealing with right now.
I guess the other question that may be coming right now is, what can we expect in terms of mosquitoes?
Yes, with the wet weather, could get warmer, and now there's a lot of situations where stagnant standing water is around. We need to be aware of mosquitoes. And so the way we approach mosquito management, first of all, is source reduction. That is, remove all stagnant standing water from bird baths, old tires, wheelbarrows, anything that holds water for an extended period of time. The other one is repellents. If you're going to be out dusk and dawn, spray your body or skin, the skin or clothes, with a repellent such as DEET, Picardian, or IR3535. Now, there's one called permethrin. Now, permethrin is an insecticide, but you don't spray it on your skin, just the clothing. And when you come back in, take a shower. And the last one is the use of, we call these larvicides, or these mosquito dunks and bits you put into water that kill the larval stage of mosquitoes. And they're completely harmless to pets and fish. All they kill is mosquito larvae. So if you have like a pond that's not agitated, or a bird bath you don't want to change, you can throw these mosquito dunks or bits. And the larva, which of course mosquitoes are mostly in the eggs on the larva, the pupa and the larva, they'll eat it and then they die. It's a stomach poison, very, very similar to BTK, but another species. This one's called BTI, Bacillus thuringiensis israeliensis, and it only kills mosquito larvae.
That's K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd with information on how to control bagworms, sawflies, and mosquitoes. For additional information, contact your local county or district extension office. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.